Hello, hello, and welcome to The Conversation. I'm Dasha Burns, White House Bureau Chief for Politico, and every week on the show, I invite one of the most compelling power players in Washington and beyond to talk about how they're navigating and shaping this incredible era of American politics. Boy, and this week was another crazy one. Let's do a little vibe check. I'm sure you're all feeling it. It's been hot. It's been swampy. I'm understanding why Washington, D.C. is called the swamp. And in addition to the chaotic weathers, the news cycle brought a good bit of chaos, especially for the White House on this Epstein stuff. The MAGA meltdown has not stopped. The White House has tried to quell it. It's not working so far, and it is becoming a serious problem for this administration and a serious distraction, which is really, really frustrating for President Trump. We've seen him lash out about it several times now this week.
It's all been a big hoax. It's perpetrated by the Democrats and some stupid Republicans.
In the middle of all of that, we also had a ton of action on the Hill. We had the rescissions bill on the Senate floor. This is the $9.4 billion clawback in spending, trying to codify some of Elon Musk's Doge cuts. And in the middle of all of that, I got to sit down with Senator Eric Schmitt, who actually was leading the rescissions bill on the Senate floor. We talked earlier in the week before that bill passed. He might not be a household name in your household, but the most important house in this city, the White House, yeah, he really matters to them because he's really become their go-to on the Hill. He very much understands the MAGA base. He's super close with Vice President J.D. Vance, and he has become the person that they really trust and rely on and have faith in to bring along some of the holdouts on the Hill. He played a really big role in getting the One Big Beautiful Bill passed, and he was leading that rescissions bill on the Senate floor this week. I wanted to talk to him about all of that, his relationships with the administration, his views on foreign policy, which are very much tied to how the MAGA base wants to keep us out of foreign conflicts, and how he's seeing how the president is shifting his views on things like NATO and Ukraine and Iran. Talk to him about the Epstein issue, of course, because he was AG in Missouri before he came to Congress. So I wanted to talk to him about what he thinks of the DOJ, of AG Pam Bondi, and how they're handling all of that. So much to talk about with Senator Schmitt. Here's our interview. Senator Schmitt, thank you so much for joining the conversation.
Good to be with you.
I think we do have to start with this room, and for those who are listening and not watching, we are sitting in one of the sort of chambers of Senator Schmitt's office, and there is just a total explosion of Cardinals memorabilia.
It's either the height of fandom or a little crazy, I think is probably. But growing up a Cardinals fan, yes, this is my. I feel like I'm at home when I'm in this conference room.
I was warned by your staff that your office does kind of have like the teen boy bedroom vibes.
Kind of. That's fair. That's fair. But actually, one of the jerseys up there is a guy by the name of David Freese, who was a hero of the 2011 World Series. When I was in law school, I actually coached David Freese, which is a weird kind of thing in life. And I like to take a little credit, but I can't really. He was good then, and
so sports number one, politics number
sure.
two. Yeah.
Yes,
there are flags in here too, but it's overtaken by the Cardinals. I do want to start with telling you when I talked to some of my folks at the White House and I told them that you were sitting down with me, they made it very clear that you are very popular on that campus.
That's nice to hear.
How would you describe your relationship with the White House?
Great. It's pretty unique. I mean, it's not lost on me what sort of a unique moment in time it is, not only for the country, but just how everything worked out with President Trump winning and then knowing a lot of the cabinet members. And really during the campaign trail, spending a lot of time traveling with President Trump. And on Trump Force One, you just had a lot of these people who are in the administration now were obviously doing a lot of the same things. And so it's just a great opportunity, I think, for the country. And then also to advocate for Missouri and an agenda that certainly strikes a chord with me. It's a pretty unique time and place, but it's a fun time to be a Republican right now in Washington. And for me specifically, just having those relationships, and even with President Trump, I mean, getting to play with President Trump, and Vice President Vance is one of my best friends, and so it's been a great experience.
Yeah, you've been golfing with the president and spent a lot of time with Vice President Vance. Tell me about those relationships.
Yeah, it's President Trump's a very good golfer, and
As he will tell you often.
a lot of club championships. And but no, for real, he's actually like doesn't miss a fairway. He's got a great short game. And for me, whether it's a background in sports or golf, there's a certain amount of camaraderie that can happen, and you can have conversations that are different conversations than you have in a meeting room or a boardroom sometimes, just when you're out playing golf. And so I feel really fortunate to have that kind of relationship with President Trump and to be one of the few senators that he golfs with. So it's
And
fun.
you and Vance, the vice president, you guys go back, right?
Well, we came in together, yes, as Senate freshmen. So we came in 2022 and really had a lot of core values. It's a unique experience. Like, coming into the United States Senate is just a unique life experience. You don't get to share that with that many people. And so our freshman class was pretty tight. And Vice President Vance and I sort of hit it off, had a lot of shared values, cared about the same things, kind of saw the world generally the same way. We still to this day have a monthly dinner, the freshmen that came in. We were at the Vice President residence recently. All of us were over there. So it's a neat bond that you have. And with JD specifically, just somebody that beyond politics is somebody that I'm friends with or would be friends with. Sometimes I judge that, like, is this person somebody that I'm hanging out with, like,
Well,
in
you
real
go to
life?
a Cardinals game with them.
Yes, exactly. And so Vice President Vance is certainly one of those guys.
Well, it's
Normal guy.
It's beyond politics, but it has also really impacted politics and your relationships on the Hill and kind of how you are moving through the Republican Party. You guys are part of the sort of new era, the new right, as you've called it before. Can you describe like this sort of faction of the Republican Party? How impactful is it, and how are you navigating sort of that wing of the party versus some of the old guard that you are also close to, folks like Susan Collins on the Hill?
I think, President Trump is a sort of a singular political figure. I think he completed this historic comeback. I mean, no one alive has seen this where somebody, came back and won a non-consecutive term, right? Many people wrote him off. I was one of the earlier endorsers. I felt like there was still his connection to real people never went away. And, when you come from a state like Missouri, you feel it. I mean, President Trump did exceptionally well in all the elections that he's been in Missouri. Missouri's always kind of had this sort of populist streak to it. It's always been suspicious of a federal government 1,000 miles away. President Trump tapped into that. And by the way, that extended to either party in Missouri's kind of history, even going back to Thomas Hart Benton. So that's sort of ingrained in our DNA. President Trump certainly tapped into that. But I think this ability to connect with real people, with working people who feel like they were left behind, sort of this double whammy of having, their jobs shipped overseas, and then you have mass migration to undercut their wages. People are frustrated with that. They're frustrated with the idea that you have these big tech behemoths who are censoring their speech. And when I was Attorney General in Missouri, we took on a lot of those fights and the excesses of the Biden administration. So for me, coming in, kind of disrupting the status quo of permanent Washington is certainly something that I ran on. I try to be a part of here. President Trump embodies that. You're seeing probably most specifically kind of a different view of foreign policy, sort of this American realism, getting away from a foreign policy that believes America can be everywhere all at once, all the time. We can't. I think we have to focus on the homeland, the Indo-Pacific specifically, ask our European allies and demand that they step up in a more meaningful way for their defense. And that's starting to happen. So what's interesting is a lot of those things that maybe in President Trump's first term were sort of ridiculed in many ways is now becoming much more of the kind of the zeitgeist. It's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, are you trying to sort of move some of the old school Republicans into this new school of thought? Like, where do you think the more establishment folks are maybe misunderstanding the direction that this movement is going?
Yeah, I think I think a slur that's often uttered is that it's an isolationist point of view. That's not true at all. I don't want to withdraw from the world, but I think we have to identify what are our
You see isolationism as a slur?
I do, because that's not accurate. I think that it's viewing the world as it is, understanding what our core national interests are, using diplomacy first, and if we have to engage, it's with overwhelming force. It's kind of a sort of a Jacksonian view of foreign policy, and I think that that is where the people are at. If you get across this country, especially on the Republican voters, that's where a majority of Republican voters are at. But I have a lot of respect. Look, I have a great working relationship with Susan Collins. We may be on different sides of this rescission piece that's going on actually this week, but I have a ton of respect for her. I think one of the things I try to do is approach this with, in every state, they're sending somebody here who's in the same position that I am. I think you have to approach it with some humility, a lot of humility, actually, about the job that you have. You have your core beliefs that you advocate for, but try to listen and work with my colleagues. And I think that's my reputation, and I'm going to continue to do that. But at the end of the day, I want to be successful. And the agenda I think that President Trump has put forth just in these first 6 or 7 months is pretty remarkable historically. I mean, we're in the middle of it, so it's hard to recognize. But you look at the nominations, you look at some of the changes that are happening within these agencies, taking on the broader administrative state. You've got the reconciliation package with the historic tax cuts that are in there, and also some investments in border security in the military. Now we're moving on to rescissions, actually taking on some of this wasteful spending that people get frustrated by. So we're living through it right now. So it's hard to kind of see what's happening, but I think this is going to end up being one of the more consequential terms that any president in my memory's had.
Yeah, this week we're living through rescissions, as you mentioned. How are you and the White House, and particularly Russ Vought, who's been sort of leading the charge on this, how are you working to shape it, to get it across the finish line?
Yeah, the White House has been very engaged on this, and I think particularly answering questions. I mean, Russ was in front of the Appropriations Committee when I presented the bill to the Appropriations Committee. I think he's the first OMB director that's actually testified on a rescissions package. And rescissions are nothing new. They've happened a bunch of times.
But there's still some frustration from folks like Susan Collins that there's not enough information being given to
and look,
lawmakers.
We want to make sure that those questions are answered. That's part of this process. I think that one of the sort of issues is that there was so much focus on reconciliation. It dominated, a lot of the time and energy for so long here that we're now moving to reconciliation, but we've got a shot clock here, right? We've got till the end of this week to actually get that done because you've got a 45-day window from when the president presents the package, and we're right in the middle of that.
One of the other big parts is the cuts to public media, which I know a lot of Trump supporters are on board with, but there are folks like Senator Mike Rounds who have raised concerns about the impact on rural areas that really rely on public radio, for example, for emergency situations. How do you address those concerns?
Yeah, I think the first thing is making sure we're providing accurate information. I think there's been a lot of misinformation out there about how emergency warnings actually go out and what channels. There's nothing here that touches FEMA's emergency response system, the actual ways that people are receiving information, those kind of emergencies. So that's the first part. Then also, making sure that we're trying to address their concerns. And Russ has, I think, been very open about that. When we pass a budget, these things aren't specifically sometimes line itemed, right? Like, we didn't line item, some of this crazy stuff that people find objectionable. It's what these agencies have actually gone out and done. And again, I think that's why this is a very important exercise to say, we've seen it. We've gone through this self-reflection. We want to correct that. And I think that can help regain the trust. Are you correcting
it via line item, though, or is it much broader sweeps than that?
I mean, I think those are identified as the abuses and the excesses and part of why you arrive at that rescission number. And I think that's a sort of a nod. Because, look, we're still doing a lot more than the $9.4 billion that's identified here. And my hope is that actually you get some of this into the muscle memory of the legislature. There's a reason why. I mean, honestly, for a lot of time, Democrats were saying, well, why don't you bring some of these reforms to a rescissions package? And now here we are with a rescissions package. So
back in 2018, Susan Collins helped tank the attempt at rescissions. She said, "I don't like tipping the power of the purse to the executive branch." Do you see those concerns at all, especially with this administration where Congress has ceded so much power, whether it's power of the purse or power when it comes to foreign policy to the executive branch?
Well, first of all, there are core Article 2 powers for the executive branch. Foreign policy happens to be one of those, the commander-in-chief powers. But listen, I'm an advocate for the Article 1 branch. I serve in the United States Senate, but I view this as differently. Clearly, the legislature actually has a role in this rescissions package. It's why we're actually making sure we have the votes to pass what the president is putting forward in the 45-day window. But I would also argue that in my first 2 years versus this year, people ask me what was your biggest takeaway, and I would say the most unpleasant surprise was how little activity actually happens on the United States Senate floor, in how we don't actually have an open amendment process for appropriations bills. So it's hard for me to digest some of the criticism about this is sort of gutting the appropriations process when we don't really have one on the floor. The Appropriations Committee might come out with bipartisan bills, but Chuck Schumer spent exactly 0 minutes on any of those bills on the Senate floor.
So you're saying the executive branch just has more ability to get stuff done, so leave it
No, not
there?
at all. I'm saying that the rescissions process actually considers the legislature's role in what the executive branch is identifying as waste, fraud, and abuse. And that's what we're doing right now. But clearly, the legislature allocates dollars to the executive branch to execute on and to spend. And so but I'm very protective of the Article 1 branch's role, but I also think the Article 2 branch has an important role in executing policy too.
Let's talk about the One Big Beautiful Bill, because that was major for the White House and for Congress. You played a pretty big role getting it over the finish line in the Senate. Can you take us behind the scenes? I know your relationship with Vice President Vance played a big role here. What were those negotiations
First of all, I just tried to be helpful. The credit really goes to Senator Thune and Vice President Vance and others who were in Mike Crapo, who were working really hard to get that done. I just tried to, whatever gaps I could bridge.
like golfing.
Like golfing, right, sure. My 9-iron, if I can use that to be helpful. No, but I just tried to help communicate with members as best I could about what the priorities were and maybe how we could, solve particular issues. So at the end of the day, you do this job because you want to have an impact. And when you're in those kind of moments and you have some of those relationships, you just want to be helpful. And that's it. But
is that what you think moved the needle, some of those bonds that you've built? I mean, you've only been in the Senate for 2.5 years, but you've been playing a pretty central role when it comes to some of the connective tissue between the White House and the Hill.
Yeah. I mean, I'd like to think I'd played a part, but I don't want to overstate it. There are a lot of people who were helpful, honestly. But yeah, it's an honor to sort of be in the mix and be helping big priorities like that get across the finish line. But I don't. I'm not too. I don't
He's
need all the
looking at his shoes while he talks about.
I don't need all the credit. That's my
a humble Missouri boy.
Right. Yeah.
Let me ask you about Missouri specifically when it comes to this bill, because your state is one of 3 that added Medicaid expansion to the state constitution. That was something that voters did, despite opposition from some Republican lawmakers in 2020. It's clear that this is something that your constituents really care about. 1 in 5 people in the state are on Medicaid. What do you make of the projections from independent organizations like the Kaiser Family Foundation that say that because of this bill and the healthcare cuts, Missouri could lose about 14% of federal Medicaid funding, amounting to $17 billion over the next decade?
I actually welcome questions like this because I think it's a great opportunity to sort of clarify what's real and what's not. Because I think that the Democrats in particular, there's a lot of fear mongering about people losing coverage. Look, the truth is, if you ask anybody and give an honest answer, the only people that are going to lose coverage here is if you're an illegal immigrant or you're an able-bodied working adult with no kids who refuses to work or volunteer for 80 hours a month. That's it. And by the way, one of the things I'm most proud of about this bill was a provision that I advocated for is we actually refocus and add additional supports for the people who need Medicaid the most. Pregnant moms, poor kids, and individuals with disabilities. So there's a provision here that provides more opportunities for in-home care, for more independence for people with disabilities and need specialized care. That didn't exist before. That's in this bill now. So I think it's a sort of a recalibration. The money that was being spent on illegal immigrants and able-bodied adults who refuse to work is now being used to shore up a system for those who need it most. So I think they were really important reforms, and I think people are supportive of that. If you look at any polling on those issues in particular, people are supportive of that.
What about rural hospitals? I mean, Kaiser Family Foundation says federal Medicaid spending in rural areas is estimated to decline by $155 billion.
Yeah, I think that much has been made of this and by a lot of the hospitals that actually don't serve rural communities. I'm very sensitive to the idea of making sure rural hospitals can continue and actually do better, and hopefully through telehealth and some technology advances, there's ways to do that. But I think the $50 billion rural hospital fund that was included in there was sort of a nod to that, to make sure that they have the support.
That's a third of the $155 billion estimate here.
Yeah, it's a pretty small percentage, though. If you actually dig down into the statements of what rural hospitals, what their mix is, they don't get as much as sort of the big city hospitals as far as what their Medicaid dollars that come in. So at the end of the day, the only reductions for benefits are going to be for people who are here illegally or able-bodied adults who refuse to work.
I think there's concern for folks that are going to fall through the cracks because of the shortened timeline for enrolling, because some people have confusion about what categories they fall under? How do you make sure people aren't falling through the cracks and losing coverage when they really deserve to be
Yeah, I think if
enrolled?
people are qualified, they should absolutely get it. Again, this is a sort of a state-based program, and you want to make sure that the states that are administering Medicaid have processes that are efficient, but also understand the challenges that people have. But the truth is, there's been a lot of waste because nobody's really checked since COVID eligibility. That's a real problem. I mean, that's kind of ridiculous. And again, you got to think of people who are working hard every single day. Their tax dollars come here, and they're part of this 60-40 split or a 90-10 split. They would expect that kind of accountability. They would expect that you would have eligibility checks at least yearly. That hasn't been happening.
How do you tackle this politically? Because the base for the GOP under Trump has changed. It is now much more working class folks who rely on these kinds of programs. How do you combat what is going to be an aggressive push from Democrats saying that Republicans don't care about the most vulnerable?
Yeah, I think, first of all, Democrats have zero credibility with the working class at this point. They've been a party that's captured by an intellectual sort of elite class that's way more focused on censoring your speech than they are about advocating for working people. I just think you want to understand why Missouri's bright red. It's because the Democrat Party is completely out of touch with the needs of working people. So I think that making sure we have an economic agenda that's reflective of that's very important to me. I think not only do you ensure that you didn't have the biggest tax increase in the history of our country of $4 trillion, what does that really mean? Well, that's thousands of dollars in the pockets of average Missourians every single year, but also the no tax on tips, no tax on overtime. That matters to real people. So sometimes, we can get caught up in sort of the pass-through entities, and those are small businesses that deserve tax relief because they put it back into their inventory and their people. But sometimes that gets lost. And so I think the ability to say, you know what, you're working your tail off, you're a waitress, you're a truck driver working overtime, you're going to keep more of your own money. Democrats oppose all of that.
I know your family has had a really big impact on your decision to go into public service and on some of your policy. Tell me about your son, Stephen, and how he's impacted your work in politics.
Yeah, so Stephen is our oldest, our first child. Stephen was born with a rare genetic condition called tuberous sclerosis. It was diagnosed at about 5 months. We didn't know what that meant at the time, but it means that he has tubers in different organs of his body. It's affected his development. Stephen's on the autism spectrum. He's nonverbal to this day. He'll be with us, and he's a great blessing. But he has epilepsy too, so his seizures are the biggest medical challenge. In fact, my wife called. He had a big one last night. So that's
I'm so sorry.
constantly. That's sort of a constant in our life. But because of that experience, and one time he had a 4-hour seizure and was in the ICU for over a week. And through that process, for me, I made partner at a law firm. My priority was my family and my career. It kind of made me reflect on what was important and this sort of discernment about what I really wanted to do with my life. And I wanted to do more than what I was doing. So that, for me, was public office. And so I ran. When I got into the Missouri Senate, we passed autism insurance reform. We did a lot of things on related for people with disabilities. I try to continue that work here. But Stephen, at the end of the day, is sort of this great touchstone for me about what's really important in life. So as much as all these things that are happening here are all very important, my family's really important to me. And I think the appreciation that there's just a lot of things that we take for granted, like you and I being able to have this conversation, is all a blessing. And Stephen's a constant reminder of that. So I'm very grateful for him.
You were Attorney General in Missouri before you joined the Senate. I'm curious what your take is on the DOJ in this term under President Trump. It does seem like it's very different, even than Trump's first term, and certainly has taken quite a different path than DOJs of administrations past.
Well, I think there's some lessons learned. I think every era is sort of defined by an era before it, and what you saw was, I think, in Joe Biden's 4 years, a great weaponization of the Department of Justice against whether it was parents who decided to show up to school board meetings, or Catholics, or the chief political rival, President Trump, trying to throw him in jail for the rest of his life. In all their confirmation hearings, they were asked this question: are you going to do the same thing? And I think they want to restore credibility to the Department of Justice. I've known Pam Bondi for years. I have a ton of respect for Pam Bondi. I spoke introduced her at her confirmation hearing. Kash Patel, same. But more, and then my Solicitor General when I was Attorney General in Missouri was a guy by the name of John Sauer, who's the Solicitor General.
Yeah,
for the
so
U.S.
you know these folks. I mean,
yeah.
It's interesting to me that it does seem like the idea of the DOJ being this like fully independent entity from the president has just changed. And
I think in some ways that's romanticized. You know, it's a cabinet position. Bobby Kennedy was JFK's attorney general as his brother.
right, like should we just give up that pretense? Because it seems like that's the case here.
Look, I think as a lawyer and certainly as an attorney general, you swear an oath to the Constitution, right? That's and so you want to abide by the law. I think though that what we saw, there's an opportunity, I think, in this country now, hopefully to regain some trust, because I think what we saw those first 4 years was really tragic for our legal system, and I don't think that you want to have it's just you go down the road of a banana republic when you start prosecuting political enemies.
You said it's a romantic notion that the DOJ is separate. Do you feel like President Trump is just being more frank and like, no, I'm working with my AG Pam Bondi?
I think there's always conversations. It's a cabinet role, right? But I also know, President Trump has a great deal of trust in Pam Bondi, and Pam Bondi is running the Department of Justice, and I think she's doing a good job, and she's got great people around her.
She is in some hot water right now, though. What do you make of the Epstein controversy that's got some MAGA folks up in arms?
It's for me, having been a prosecutor, it's just really hard to know. Like, I don't know what they're looking at. Like, I don't know. I mean, I think people have questions, no doubt. That's very natural.
Should they release more information?
I don't know what they have. I don't know what they don't have. And when you're making a charging decision, obviously you're basing it on the information that's in front of you. So it's just hard for me to, opine on it. Not trying to dodge the question. That's just the truth.
No, I totally get it. I mean, I think that folks in the base are sort of up in arms, both because they want to know what's in it, and also kind of how it's been handled. Like as a former AG, would you have handled sort of the rollout differently?
I think I could have. Although I have a book out about my time as AG now, but I could have probably wrote a book about the things you don't do as Attorney General, right? Because there's just a lot of things that people might think you're going to charge, but there's just not enough evidence there. I don't know. It could be also that, and I don't know this, so I really don't want to speculate, but they never got the information that they thought they were going to get, or I have no idea the chain of custody, any of this stuff. So some of it's just speculation, which I'm fine to speculate on political matters all the time, but on these kind of legal matters, it's a little more difficult.
I do want to talk about foreign policy, because that is such a cornerstone for you. This Russia, Ukraine, Trump trifecta right now that's going on. It does seem like President Trump has really warmed to Zelensky, is incredibly frustrated with Putin. There is a sanctions bill that Lindsey Graham is working on with the White House. Should the president get more aggressive with Putin?
I definitely think you've seen a change in the dynamic. There's no doubt about that. I think the North Star for President Trump is he wants to bring the parties together for a peace deal. That is what his goal is, and that is what his interest is. And so any leverage that can be brought to bear to bring that about, I think, is something that should be on the table.
Has your own thinking on Ukraine changed as the president's has?
Well, I would say I don't want to. I'll let the president speak for himself, but I think the idea that that we don't want to have the core national interests of the United States need to be front and center. And if the concern is that a distraction of whether it's resources or certainly people, soldiers, which I wouldn't support at all, is a bit of a distraction from our chief adversary, which is China. The 21st century will be defined by who wins this great powers.
So are we looking to the wrong place when we're sending weapons?
Absolutely. I think we need to pivot to Asia more aggressively, and our European allies need to step up in a more meaningful way. And I think the nuance of what's happening in real time right now with allowing NATO allies to buy weapons is it's facilitating Europe's role to play a more of an important part of their own national defense.
Do you think it's a mistake, though, to give some of our weapons in that direction?
I'm confident that the weapons that will be sold will not, with this administration, won't affect our ability to defend ourselves, or as we pivot to the long range fires that we will need in the Indo-Pacific. But I would also say too, I think the 150 billion that we added with the reconciliation on top of the baseline that we've got for the NDAA are making very important investments in what we need in the Indo-Pacific. So I think this administration understands that. I think that Europe, though, the long-term strategy has to be that Europe is much more involved in these sorts of things, and the United States doesn't get entangled with these sort of forever foreign conflicts. I don't support that. If there is something that we need to be engaged in, we need to do it with overwhelming force. But we need to be very clear that we're not going to be the cop on the beat around the world anymore. Those days are over.
You've been very skeptical of NATO in the past. The president seems like he's very much changed his tune on NATO now that they're, in his view, paying their fair share. Are you still skeptical of that alliance, or has your view shifted?
Well, I don't know. I would say I'm skeptical of the alliance. I think the burden sharing has been out of whack for a very, very long time. And the idea that they're stepping up to 5% is a very important concession on their part, or I should say a realization of what's needed. Now, the proof will be in the pudding, though. 5% on pensions is very different than 5% on munitions. 5% of your GDP doesn't win wars, weapons do. So if they're actually committed to their own defense, that will be a game changer, because if they actually committed the same amount to their defense that we do, it would free up about $300 billion annually for us to focus on the Indo-Pacific. That would be a game changer. So I think President Trump, for all the gnashing of teeth that has happened over the last several years with how he's handled it, he's gotten results here. And Europe has finally moved for the first time in literally probably 60 years.
All right, Senator Schmitt, thank you so much for joining the conversation. We appreciate you.
Yep, thanks.
Thanks so much to Senator Eric Schmitt for joining the conversation. Now, in just a moment, I'll be joined by my colleague Ben Jacobs, who's been paying really close attention to some of the primaries happening around the country for insights, maybe some hints, maybe a little crystal ball into what we are looking at down the pike as we head towards the midterms and even potentially 2028, what these say about where the parties are at. And this week, he's been focused on Democrats, particularly progressives. He was looking at this primary in Arizona that generated a ton of buzz because of this 25-year-old influencer that was in the race trying to shake things up. Her name is Deja Fox, and she has a bunch of followers on social media. Now, Deja Fox did not win, but I've been so interested in how influencers are getting into the political world, whether as candidates or just people with big followings online that are helping shape the message and the narrative. So here's my conversation with Ben Jacobs. Ben, hello, my friend. Thank you so much for joining the conversation.
Thanks so much for having me, Dasha.
So, Ben, your piece on Deja Fox was like the most read thing on our site for a while. She was generating all of this buzz. I kept turning on the TV and seeing stuff from her or about her. She has a huge following on social media. She is super young. How old is she?
25.
25. She's 25 years old. But all of that buzz and all the social media following and all of her popularity didn't actually translate to the local community and to that vote on Tuesday. What do you think happened?
I mean, I think what happened is that you have the daughter of the former congressman running this district, which was based around Tucson. And there's a question of how much that message resonated, that she was running on the fact that she was 25. She was running in a seat where the incumbent Rahul Grijalva, had died in office, had sort of been in ill health and continued to run for office and run for re-election in the House at a point where Democrats have actually lost votes in the House because if people hadn't died, they would have been in shape. This wasn't about competing views of the Democratic Party. This was clearly a generational message. And in a low turnout special election in the middle of the summer in Tucson, election day was relatively cool there. It was a high of 99. Not a lot of people voted, and the people who did were older, were more traditional Democrats, and they were not on TikTok, though hopefully with the weather, they at least had their air conditioning on.
You said relatively cool. I was like 99. Oh my word. Yeah, this is the state where like people fall on the sidewalk and get like third-degree burns.
Yeah.
So not a lot of the kids are like going out to to vote on those days.
Not a lot of anybody's going out to vote, period.
And this, like you said, there wasn't a ton of difference in ideology between the two. It was framed, the race, it largely in the media as like a generational progressive contest. There were a lot of comparisons to Mamdani in New York, but it doesn't fit that neatly, actually. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
It doesn't fit that neatly at all. That on one hand, you have a younger Democrat who's building a reputation through viral videos running against a second-generation politician. Adelita Grijalva, Raul Grijalva's daughter, been a local county elected official that she certainly had. The highs of her elected career were not the same as high as Andrew Cuomo's, but certainly the lows were not the same either. She wasn't forced from office in a sexual harassment scandal. There wasn't the accusations that she covered up the deaths of thousands during COVID, that she just wasn't Andrew Cuomo. And so much of the New York race was about what a unique politician Andrew Cuomo was. And there are obviously a score of other issues playing there that you could talk about Mondami's sort of left-wing views and sort of more fringe views on topics like Israel. But none of that mattered here, that this was, if you were doing framing it in a very simple way, you could sort of make this work. That is a one-sentence description. The race was similar. But once you got 2 or 3 sentences in, they had nothing else in common.
And Grijalva had the endorsement of AOC and Bernie Sanders. That's a big factor here, right?
I think it helped with sort of progressive credibility. These were sort of checking the box endorsements that sort of reassured voters of progressive credibility. But this was not a race about ideology or sort of who would vote how, or sort of any substantive differences between Grijalva and Deja Fox.
We have to talk about the role of David Hogg here. He was obviously a supporter of Fox's. I wonder if her loss kind of speaks to why he sort of left the DNC, why there was that schism there, because his critics, including Rahm Emanuel, who on this very podcast argued that he was pushing for a generational change against solidly progressive candidates just for the sake of change, instead of focusing on just winning seats that Democrats need to ultimately win back power. Do you think that there are lessons that younger progressives need to learn from this and maybe rethink their strategy here?
Look, I think some of the David Hogg approach is something that gets a lot of attention. But, this is the second candidate he's endorsed. They've both sort of done badly. Raul Grijalva, you could have an explicit primary campaign there based on age when he was very ill, but no one ran against him. And running against his daughter on the basis that her father was old is not the most successful message.
Yeah, and it seems like, more broadly, what you've been finding in your reporting is sort of this disconnect between both the media bubble, frankly, our bubble, and the conversations that are happening online versus the reality of people in these communities that are actually going out and casting ballots.
Yes, and I think it's worth noting that communities are very different too. You had this huge surge in youth turnout in New York in particularly neighborhoods where you have a lot of younger college-educated voters, that there's no Bushwick in Arizona. There's no Astoria in Arizona, that you're dealing with at this point an electorate that was, it's a majority Hispanic district. The data shows that voters who came out were older voters, that, elections are different, and that, some of the online attention you got, that there really aren't a lot of places like what it's called the communist corridor of sort of the neighborhoods of young left-wing people starting in Queens going down to Brooklyn. You can't replicate that almost anywhere else in the country.
Well, and that's what I've been kind of saying is it's actually really hard to extrapolate too much from any of these races to sort of paint, a broad brush model for Democrats, because these communities in these races are unique. I think the one thing that does continue to become a theme is it's candidates that feel authentic to people more than whatever ideology or policy they represent. It's people that feel like they actually are, mean what they say and, tell it like it is, so to speak. That's something I've heard about Trump a lot, but it is something that I hear about other candidates that resonate in surprising ways. I do wonder on this influencer piece, there's been kind of an increase in influencer types and in younger people that are very online, getting into politics, either running or getting huge followings from their political content. Do you think this is a trend that we will continue to see, influencers getting into politics and into running campaigns?
I think certainly, and I think that that she's sort of one road marker along the way, that that we've seen an entire shift in how people consume the media, that a lot fewer people now watch network news or local news than they did 10 or 15 years ago. And that trend is just going to continue. That, traditionally one of the hallmarks of candidate recruitings in a congressional race was the best if you could get the local news anchor, the local weatherman, that's gold because they're coming into so many people's houses every day. They're trusted voice. They obviously have some media training. And Deja Fox was a test of how much as influencers are sort of replacing traditional media, sort of the social media content, what that means for candidates. And there are real flaws there because part of the reasons influencers are, popping up is that the media environment is fractured, so that it means figures don't necessarily have the reach, and that, a national audience applies locally, but there's no such thing as a local influencer. There's no Joe Rogan of Tucson or no Theo Vaughn of Tacoma, Washington.
It's interesting because influencers have broadly just become such a huge part of the political conversation, especially given the role that they played in Trump's victory. I mean, there was so much talk of the role that Joe Rogan played and Theo Vaughn, like those guys that you mentioned. But it is quite a different ecosystem on the left versus the right.
Mm-hmm. Yes. No, it's totally different that there's a much more that still folks on the left still disproportionately read traditional media sources, that this is not about, whether they're listening to NPR, but like Democratic voters are more likely to still take the local paper. Democrat voters are more likely to watch the 11 o'clock news at night. And that you've already seen this sort of fracturing of the ecosystem in the way that you've seen on the right, that, statements Laura Loomer has made about, the Epstein stuff has been big news. There's no Laura Loomer of the left, that there are no sort of comparable figures when you work through Charlie Kirk types on the right. And some of this is built in, that there was never 30 years ago, there's never a Rush Limbaugh of the left, that there never were sort of radio talk shows in the same way. But the split is sort of further growing because, Rush Limbaugh had a broader media audience of, tens of millions of people, whereas, there's a Laura Loomer audience, there's a Charlie Kirk audience, that things are a bit more fractured, and there's still no one, even with the ability to command a mass audience among the base.
Well, and now you're seeing, those very same people become a problem for the president with the Epstein files and the revolt of those of those very same characters, right?
Yes. And, that it's sort of, you're dealing with people with nominally independent power bases. It's, a real question of how much it's built in a reflection of Trump, but with their own sort of motivations, as opposed to, that the motivations of the New York Times or CNN are not ideological, not about sort of keeping the attention on sort of, and not about sort of making sure people are continuing to stay ideological the same way.
Ben, thank you so much for joining the conversation. This was fascinating. We can't wait to have you back.
Terrific. Me too. Looking forward to it.
This has been The Conversation with Dasha Burns. We'll be back next week. If you want to catch future episodes of The Conversation, click that subscribe button below. And thanks for watching.